Thank you all for coming, and thanks to John Peace and Heights Library for having me here to discuss my research with you today. And thank you also all for attending. I know it's not everyone who comes out on a beautiful, you're probably having some air quality issues, which I apologize for, but on a summer night to hear a talk on the history of medical racism. Before I begin, I also should give a bit of a content warning. My talk engages with themes such as medical racism, suicide, violent subjugation, and includes images of spaces with human remains. As a result, you'll also notice that I have some placeholder slides because some of the images are a little bit more grisly than others, so I don't have to leave them up on the screen. Finally, some quotes also include outdated racial terms, although no specific racial slurs. So with that said, I'm really glad for this opportunity to tell you more about my findings on the history of slavery and racial science in U.S. medical schools. I'll do so first by discussing an individual story of how medical professionals' embrace of racial science affected diverse lives in the antebellum United States. The story acts as a segue to discussing my researches and my book's larger argument about how medical schools became the central site for the dissemination of biodeterminist racial science in the last decades of chattel slavery in the United States. And I also argue that it's critical to examine this pre-professional period so we see the history of medical racism as a long, multi-century trend, rather than one that's just focused on the period of eugenics, where it seems like it's a kind of convenient, short beginning and end to medical racism, but rather what we are seeing, the continuance of medical racism today, really began in the 19th and 18th centuries, and perhaps even before. For most of my talk, I'm going to focus on how race was taught in medical schools, examining a pedagogy that asserted that racial differences were real, permanent, and could be used to organize American society into racial hierarchies. Then I'll also discuss how environmental theories were used to naturalize the poor health outcomes of enslaved people, whether it be racial anatomy or environmental racism. Antebellum medical students learned racial science through diverse methods, ranging from reading textbooks and listening to lectures, to measuring skulls and writing about race in their final project to graduate from medical school. With that, though, I want to begin by telling you the history of Stormon as a window into the intimate effects of antebellum racial science. Stormon was born in Little Namaqualand, near the modern border of contemporary South Africa and Namibia. And you can see that on the map in my slide on the left. The left map is a map of Little Namaqualand. By the time he arrived in Boston in 1860, Stormon was approximately 16 years old, and you can see what's an artistic rendering of him, a very offensive one, admittedly, here on the left of the screen. This is an advertisement that I'll get to in a moment. By the time he arrived in Boston in 1860, he was 16 years old. Already he had experienced a chaotic life. Dispossessed of their grazing lands as a child, Stormon's family hunted and gathered in the shadows of Dutch Boer settlements. As a teenager, he trekked himself more than 1,000 miles to the coastal Indian Ocean city of Natal. And that's on the Indian Ocean coast. After working as a guide for white hunting parties, Stormon made one desperate decision. He came to Boston in search of a better life. Instead, though, he ended up in a P.T. Barnum exhibit at the city's Aquarial Gardens. And you can see that advertisement for this exhibit in the right pane on the slideshow. On display with 4 other men from Southern Africa, Stormon was forced to portray stereotypes of African indigeneity. Every day he performed what exhibitors called the war and love dances, while holding stereotypical objects like clubs and spears. In less than a year, Stormon hanged himself. The story sent shockwaves through the Boston press. Only 6 months earlier, newspapers attempted to justify the exhibit. They claimed the arrangement between the promoters and the British government in South Africa was nothing like the slave trade. This was, of course, a particularly awkward time for Bostonians to be trafficking in Africans. The secession crisis had begun just months after the exhibit, and the city was the center of a national abolitionist movement. Left out of newspapers was how Stormon's body was given to Harvard's medical school, where they turned his remains into teaching tools and supposed evidence of racial difference. It's critical, though, to understand that Stormon's tragic suicide may not have been just a case of desperation. He likely believed in an afterlife. Many African religions, as well as syncretic forms of Christianity, did not see suicide as immoral. Thus, his suicide may have been one more, if somewhat desperate, attempt to wrest control over his existence, whether in the name of escape, rebellion, or pursuit of a better afterlife. More broadly, Stormon's history reminds us of the profound human cost of creating and disseminating racial theories. 19th century medical students learned supposed racial differences literally on the bodies of people like Stormon. Scientists at Harvard measured and made casts of his remains. They articulate his skeleton as a teaching tool. He was an unwilling participant in the production of 19th century racial science. Moreover, collections of people's remains brought prestige and scientific legitimacy to medicine and the allied sciences. Stormon's life is as much a part of this history as are the accounts I'm going to give of antebellum faculty like Joseph Leidy at the University of Pennsylvania, John Collins Warren of Harvard, or Samuel Henry Dixon of the Medical College of South Carolina. My research then captures titanic shifts in the history of American medical education, spanning from just one medical school in 1765 to over 50 at the start of the Civil War in 1861. During this period, physicians like Declaration of Independence signer, Penn professor, abolitionist, and racial theorist Benjamin Rush could truly believe that chattel slavery was in decline. This was just before Eli Whitney's invention of the modern cotton gin in the 1790s. After that, everything would change. Slavery again began to expand geographically in the newly formed United States, something scholars call the second slavery. Yet by this point, the United States already had an active abolitionist movement. Thus, U.S. medical schools were uniquely shaped by a century of national and Atlantic debates over the abolition of slavery, beginning with 18th century colonial abolition initiatives. My argument today, and more broadly, is threefold. First, as white allopathic physicians faced a crisis of public confidence in the 19th century, doctors embraced medical schools and biodeterminist racial theories as a marketing means to establish their legitimacy in a competitive marketplace. Thus, in my book, I argue that racial thinking underwrote the professionalization of medicine in the United States. Second, the proliferation of medical schools allowed physicians to lay claim to being a national profession with a shared ideology and set of practices. This was not just racial ideas produced in the South, but also in places like Ohio, Massachusetts, and New York State. By the end of the antebellum era, a whole generation of physicians emerged that were trained to see racial groups as defined by imagined anatomical and physiological differences. Racial groups, students learned, were suited to and healthy in specific environments. Thus, faculty could argue that racial difference was anatomically ordained and that plantation labor in the southern subtropics was uniquely healthy for people of African descent. Third, unpacking the life stories of people like Stormon, whose skulls were displayed at Harvard, reveals that U.S. racial medicine can be only completely understood through a transnational lens that captures the breadth of the African diaspora. Even before slavery was abolished, medical racial theories were connected to and being applied to the potential colonization of Cuba, Liberia, and other parts of the global tropics. Thus, I argue that medical schools were the central site for the dissemination of racial science in the United States before the Civil War, in revealing how early American physicians created a culture of racial theorizing. I will also analyze the relationship between schools and diverse Black communities in the United States and abroad, from New York City to South Africa. Before I move into my main argument, I wish to give some context about the history of race science and medical schools. First, compared to the 18th century, where US medical schools only issued a little more than 200 MDs, close to 30,000 were granted from 1840 to 1859, a titanic shift in the number of doctors in the United States. During this period, schools were founded in significant numbers in the Northeast, Southeast, and in the Midwest, including the Medical College of Ohio, now the University of Cincinnati's Medical School, and the Western Reserve College in Cleveland, now Case Western. Second, few Black people were admitted to medical schools during this period. James McCune Smith, pictured here, was the first African American to receive an MD, but he had to study in Glasgow. Samuel F. McGill, on the other hand, had already emigrated to Liberia when he came to the US to pursue a medical degree at Dartmouth and become the first Black graduate of a US medical school. Early state licensing, medical licensing, also actively excluded practitioners with Black ancestry. Third, during the 1840s and 1850s, American scientists increasingly embraced the theory of polygenesis, or that each race was created by God as distinct species and suited for separate continents. During this period, polygenesis briefly supplanted monogenesis among scientists in the Christian world. Naturalists had long contended that all humans derived from a single pair, i.e., Adam and Eve. After the Darwinian Revolution began in 1859, though, the supposed anatomical racial traits that I'll discuss later that were outlined by polygenous had continued valence in American medicine. So the science lives on after the end of the antebellum period. Fourth, antebellum medical student dissertations, a key piece of evidence for my research, were not akin to modern medical research with an emphasis on originality. Rather, they were derivative and thus reflected what a student learned about mainstream ideas on a specific medical topic. Many were plagiarized. One medical professor in the 1870s even suggested a ritual burning of them every year to celebrate the 4th of July. So, maybe next week you can burn some medical theses. The point being, dissertations reflected medical pedagogy, not the original scholarship of an individual. Thus, for my talk, they're particularly useful for telling you about what medical students learned about racial difference and the supposed inherent differences. We should say these differences are discredited, but supposed inherent differences of African Americans in particular. For the mostly white students attending antebellum medical schools, their education was practical. They learned medicine through training, through working on the bodies of Black people, immigrants, and the impoverished. Most critically, in the everyday operations of medical schools, students and faculty routinely stole the bodies of Black and other marginalized people. Dissection at this point was seen as a critical rite of passage. It steeled students mentally for surgery. They intentionally cultivated a detachment from patients, which was compounded on by scientific racism toward Black people. For schools like the Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia or the Medical College of South Carolina, the enslaved population was key for obtaining cadavers. As the Medical College of South Carolina in Charleston advertised in 1841, quote, subjects for dissection are obtained in ample number, chiefly from the Black population, and at far less expense, it is believed, than in any other institution in the country. Dissection also engendered resistance, though, among free Black populations. In an anonymous editorial in the 1780s, one free Black man threatened students with death if they entered Black cemeteries in New York City. Moreover, archaeological study of the 18th century African burial ground in New York City even sparked new revelations on this question. 2 graves possessed bodies that appeared to have been partially dissected. And you can see an illustration of the archaeological site here in my slide, where the bodies disrupted in a way that the archaeologists were able to verify evidence signs of postmortem violence on the body. The most logical explanation for this was not that faculty and students grew a conscience during the dissection. Instead, they were likely in some way confronted by the local Black population and potentially white allies and forced to return the bodies. The Black New Yorkers found body snatching an important issue to coalesce around, though, also revealed the degree to which burial grounds were a vital space for community and identity formation in the local African diaspora population. Despite the diversity of ethnic backgrounds among New York's African-descended population, the burial ground revealed a remarkably unified culture in terms of interment. African-descended communities in the U.S. formed shared cultures, and thus we shouldn't be surprised that the vast majority of Black New Yorkers buried in the 18th century had coffins and shrouds. They were placed supine on their backs with their heads facing west. Likewise, until the city's Common Council outlawed the practice in 1722, most burials took place at night, a custom that was common among many West African societies, and we can still see to some extent today in places like New Orleans and parts of Latin America. This ordinance, the 1722 ordinance, also revealed that white governing officials feared the cultural formation taking place around these burial sites. The history of the African burial ground thus exposed that, in this early period, Black New Yorkers understood a proper burial as an essential rite. And we should know that they saw grave robbing as both a physical and spiritual attack on their communities. As may be becoming clear, racial theorists in early American medical schools directed a great deal of focus on anatomy, dissection, and the use and display of human remains. For example, antebellum racial scientist and medical professor Samuel Morton included racial skull measurements in the textbook he wrote. So too did Penn faculty William Horner and his successor Joseph Leidy. Lectures illustrated this dynamic further. Faculty like Leidy and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. at Harvard described supposed anatomical differences across the body. And if the name Oliver Wendell Holmes rings a bell, Sr. was also a very famous poet in the 19th century, as well as a professor at Harvard, and his son was a Supreme Court justice, a very prominent one in the early 20th century. So, very prominent families we're dealing with here. In his anatomy lectures at the University of Pennsylvania from 1853 to 1891, Joseph Leidy taught students about supposed racial differences in the cranium. And note that periodicity, 1853 to 1891, he teaches well after the Civil War, and his lectures remain consistent. So we shouldn't be surprised that some of these ideas and medical stereotypes will not only persist after the end of slavery, but studies have shown that they persist today, and which I'd be happy to get into more in discussion as well. Leidy told his students that there were more significant anatomical differences between lions and tigers, two separate species, than Black and white people. Yet he explained that no naturalist ever said that lions and tigers were the same species. The implied question being, why would anyone say that Black and white people were the same species? He went on to demarcate numerous supposed anatomical differences that were peculiar to African descendants' bodies. He claimed they had narrower pelvises, longer limbs in relation to the body, longer feet, shorter toes, shorter neck, smaller and longer heel bones, and no arch in the foot. To his students, Leidy literally depicted African descendants' bodies as diverging from whites from head to toe. The small differences, he said, were negligible on their own. If it were just one or two of these small issues, it wouldn't necessarily justify separate speciation. When combined, though, they defined African descendants as an entirely distinct species, Leidy claimed. Methodologically speaking, lectures employed a visual style to teach these supposed differences that blended oral content with demonstration. We've got here, this is a pretty famous painting of an anatomy lecture given in London in the 1830s. While it's in London, I don't think there's much reason to believe it's different, and as I'll unpack in a little bit, from how anatomy was being taught in the United States. Just take a quick look at the picture. You can actually see a hanging skeleton. Professor is down here in the middle of this kind of circular auditorium. It's actually a skull sitting in front of him on a table, pictures of skulls on the kind of chalkboard, human remains arranged and hung from the chalkboard. And notes from Harvard's anatomy lectures show a very similar approach to decorating the anatomical room. So visual and tactile instruction in anatomy was meant to make medical and supposed racial knowledge easy to retain and empirical. In the introductory lecture to his first session at Harvard in 1847, Oliver Wendell Holmes argued that the power of a visually oriented anatomical lecture resided in observation's ability to render anatomical knowledge objectively real. Holmes explained, "I have attempted, therefore, to render everything visible which the eye could take cognizance of, and so turn abstractions and catalogues of names into substantial and objective realities." Holmes used images, models, and anatomical specimens as a part of a larger pedagogical approach to anatomy. He even contacted polygenist and Harvard colleague Louis Agassiz for works from his private collections. Most visuals that Holmes might have used were sketches of people from around the world or human crania, but also potentially like racial maps that showed the supposed natural location of each group around the world. In addition to visuals, lectures also had tactile components. Anatomical objects were passed around. Skulls were displayed. They even taught students how to use a craniometer, which is depicted here in this image. And so at the top G up here, you would put lead shot down into the skull to supposedly measure the volume of the cranium, which was supposed to correlate to brain size, which was supposed to correlate to intelligence. So a lot of logical jumps there, but that's the idea of the science. In short, the racial theories taught in antebellum medical schools had this enduring rather than fleeting effect. They'd also live on in fields like anthropology as well, particularly what we now would call physical anthropology, although certainly they have attempted to be less racialist in that field in the 21st century. Students also wrote about these anatomical differences or supposed anatomical differences. Hailing from South Alabama, when J. Ramsey McDowell arrived in Philadelphia in the 1850s, he was likely well-versed in the racist thought pervading slave societies. His 1857 thesis, though, displayed how medicine impacted his worldview. For example, McDowell was one of several students who in their theses paraphrased Joseph Leidy, telling students that Black and white people were more different than lions and tigers. As well as learning about racial difference in a bustling northern metropolis, McDowell was privy to an international set of influences through reading and lectures. He cited Louis Agassiz, along with deceased European luminaries and comparative anatomists. Education expanded McDowell's worldview and social network. Comprised of half Southern students, schools like the University of Pennsylvania brought together white male youths from across the Mason-Dixon line. Together, the students expanded their knowledge beyond the parochial racism of plantation districts, perhaps even cities like Philadelphia, and instead embraced a cosmopolitan racial science that was being disseminated from cities like Paris, but also places like Cincinnati, New Orleans, and of course, Philadelphia. It shouldn't be any surprise, though, that polygenist ideas were rife with internal contradictions. Frederick Douglass pointed out many of these shortcomings in a speech at the Western Reserve College in 1854. So, just nearby at Case Western. For example, pioneering craniologist and anatomy professor Samuel Morton had fetishized Egyptians as the progenitors of so-called Western civilization. Douglass noted, though, about Morton's descriptions of Egyptians that they would have been considered Black and enslavable in the United States South. Douglass asserted, "A man in our day with brown complexion," and here he's quoting Morton, "nose rounded and wide, lipstick, hair black and curly, back to Douglass's words, would, I think, have no difficulty in getting himself recognized as Black. But transitioning out of anatomy into environmental racism, students also learned about racial theories about the climate. When analyzing theories of race and the environment, it becomes clear that these pedagogies would be influential on both the United States' domestic and foreign policy. Even as politicians weighed abolishing slavery, the country became more intimately connected to the forces of empire and global capitalism. Thus, students began to consider the traits of a global array of supposed racial groups. When discussing a racial practice in their theses, students echoed significant medical texts on race by important racial scientists and medical professors like Medical College of Ohio's Daniel Drake. And in a quick sidebar, Drake wrote some prominent articles in a major newspaper arguing that this racial science should be used to bar free Black people from entering the state of Ohio. But as well as Samuel Morton, who I mentioned, and Josiah Knott, the founder of the medical school at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Assuming a medical relationship among race, environment, and practice, professors and students sought to manage the environmental health of each race. Some students considered the question of race and health through larger questions of internal and international migration, very similar to what Drake argued. And they understood themselves to be social doctors, as well as simply practicing on individual bodies. In the case of diseases such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, yellow fever, and malaria, students linked innate protections or susceptibility of African-descended people to relationships to hot and cold climates. Particularly, they argued that African descendants' supposed innate resistance or immunity to yellow fever made them ideal for toil on plantations in the U.S. South, among other tropical slave economies. Professors in medical schools characterized African descendants as exceptionally fit for the toil of slavery in the southern subtropics, and students almost unanimously agreed with them. For example, medical department of the University of Pennsylvania student Elliott Smith of Mississippi inquired in 1857, quote, "If persons can become attacked, why are many who have been raised in the midst of marshes yearly attacked?" If persons can become acclimated, I should say. "And why also cannot the white man become acclimated and dwell in security on the coast of Africa?" Smith intended these questions to be read as rhetorical, as he believed the answers obvious. By invoking white health in Africa, moreover, Smith positioned race as essential to the healthy navigation of the Atlantic world and the establishment of U.S. colonies overseas. To look at this more broadly, though, 28 students wrote about racial difference and immunity to malaria, but only 4 believed that Black and white people were both susceptible. Likewise, 17 students discussed yellow fever and race, but 16 argued that Black people were less susceptible than whites, or that when Black people got yellow fever, their symptoms were much milder. And while malaria is more complicated and not racial, but I can get to that more detail in the Q&A, there is no evidence of yellow fever immunity as an inherited trait by any group in the world. Thus, students believed that African descendants maintained constitutions that protected them from the worst diseases of the plantation South and elsewhere. In 1850, Medical College of South Carolina student J.P. Bonner argued that African descendants' protection from tropical fevers was not only vital to the plantation South, but to the entire Atlantic economy. Bonner explained, without the slaves' aid, the spindles and looms of Manchester, England, of Lowell, Massachusetts, and of all the large manufactories must in a great measure remain idle. The fertile plantations of the South and West, and by West you would have meant somewhere like Kentucky, must go uncultivated, and our extensive forests must remain as they now are, the storehouses of malaria. For Bonner, enslaved African descendants represented a perfect engine for an Atlantic economy tied together by cotton. If slavery were somehow to end, to not just spell the end of the South, but the entire Atlantic economy would be crushed, he believed. As such, students were required to understand Black health for their practice and to preserve the prosperity of the nation, students like Bonner would argue. And to just give a little bit of a sense of the international scope of slavery still in this period, this is a map of where slavery was in 1842. You can see that in most of South America, it still remains, as well as most of North America. And really what we're looking at here is outside of the British colonies, the vast majority of the large-scale plantation of colonies still had slavery well into the 19th century. And places like Cuba and Brazil would not abolish slavery for more than 20 years after the United States did. So both nationally and in the Atlantic, physicians used polygenesis to frame the appropriate place for Black people, both geographically and socially. And this is once again a world where slavery is a transnational institution. Additionally, racial medicine had practical applications for managing the healthcare and everyday life of enslaved people. Students routinely described Black people as experiencing less pain, a stereotype that lives on today and affects people's health outcomes adversely today. Students also almost universally asserted that Black people should be bled less, still the main therapeutic of the period. Recalling his time spent as a student in Philadelphia, Mobile racial scientist and founder of the Medical College of Alabama, Josiah Knott, explained that his professors at the University of Pennsylvania had told him that Black patients rarely bear bloodletting or depletion in any form. Knott also remembered that when treating Black people for pulmonary diseases as a student at the Philadelphia Almshouse, the prescribed course of treatment focused on stimulants and quinine instead of bleeding, as would have been practiced on whites. So once again, this racial medicine was practiced nationally, not just in the South, which I think gives hints into why racism in medicine has been so difficult to extricate from medicine today. The notion that Black people could safely undertake little or no bleeding appeared to be a near universal tenet. Of the 10 students from the University of Pennsylvania, Medical College of South Carolina, and University of Nashville that discussed venesection and race, or bloodletting and race, all agreed that Black patients must be bled less because of their purportedly weak constitutions. In addition to therapeutic questions, medical students discussed the need to control enslaved patients as a part of everyday practice. Wary of enslaved people feigning illness to avoid work, medical practitioners devised brutal schemes to combat enslaved agency on the plantation. In an undated notebook, one University of Pennsylvania student recounted a case where fever had broken out on a Virginia plantation. Either not trusting the reality of the condition or not caring, the enslaver dug a grave in the middle of the field. He told the enslaved laborers that the next one to complain of illness would be buried alive in that same grave. Along similar lines, in his thesis in 1850 at the Medical College of South Carolina, student Moses McLeod explained that detecting enslaved people's false claims required physicians' total discrimination and acuteness. On constant guard for deception, McLeod, in one case, ordered a slave to be whipped to cure, and that's a quote, his supposedly false claim of having a concussion. When working with enslaved patients, physicians often relied on the same brutal norms as planters. For students, racial science had deep insights into how to control the United States racial population. Students even bent medical theories toward making claims about the health risks of fugitivity and emancipation. In 1817, William Paxson, a University of Pennsylvania student from Virginia, used Black people's supposed intolerance for cold to explain their increased rates of contracting pneumonia in the warmer southern subtropics. Paxson asserted, created to bask in the solar ray, the African can only flourish when he feels the genial influence of the tropic sun. Remove him from it, like an exotic plant, he droops and dies. And once again, this is an argument that would be made over and over again against abolition, against admitting free Black people into states in the Midwest and the North. And thus we can see that students were tacitly really debating the end of slavery when they discussed these medical theories. And at best, they were divided over the issue and left serious doubts for white Americans about whether or not it would be safe to abolish the institution. even if you were potentially in a free, quote unquote, free state. So just as some students believe that African descendants face serious health risks from cold weather and emancipation, they also argued that freedom and cool climates endangered the psychological health of African descendants. In his 1852 thesis on the causes of insanity in the United States, Medical College of South Carolina student Joseph Hinson Mellichamp set out to account for the supposed fact that the proportion of insane among the Blacks and whites, especially the former, is much greater in the non-slaveholding states than slaveholding states, and quote that the African is only insane in a state of freedom. For Mellichamp, the supposed increased levels of insanity among Black people in the North had two possible explanations. The first possibility, he argued, was that Black people could be experiencing higher rates of insanity due to the pressure of social and intellectual situations that supposedly exceeded their potential. Second, in the North, Black people were exposed to far colder temperatures going against their alleged predisposition for tropical climes, and thus causing mental collapse. Mellichamp contrasted high rates of mania among free Black people in the North with the allegedly sound mental health of Black people under Southern slavery. And this is based on the since discredited 1840 census that I could get into more or discuss more in the Q&A. Mellichamp explained that all the ills which the slave may casually suffer from tyranny and injustice do not leave their impress upon him. No matter how violent the punishment, Mellichamp seemed to say, enslavers could only physically, not mentally damage enslaved people. In this frame, Black people were mentally healthiest in their proper environment and occupation. Once enslaved people grasped freedom and migrated north, however, their mental health deteriorated. Students even claimed that hard labor was therapeutic. Specifically, they argued that plantation labor protected Black people from dyspepsia or indigestion, a disease that was the offspring of ease and luxury and affluence, and according to one student, endemic to all of Scandinavia. Protection from indigestion was further proof of the benefits of slave labor. One Medical College of South Carolina student explained in 1842 that the laboring Africans are a class that never has time to lead an active life. And what an awful way to phrase that. And we will find them strong, vigorous, and healthy, and enjoying richly all the pleasures that health can afford. Through racial science, students depicted Black people as immune to the diseases of civilization. Disease immunity then existed in the same set of binaries that shaped social life in the US and Atlantic world: Black versus white, civilization versus savagery. Students' essays mirrored this larger worldview set out by authors and professors such as Josiah Nott and Joseph Leidy. They imagined African descendants' bodies as something that reacted wholly differently to the environment compared to whites. Theoretically distinct, Black people required alternative social and legal treatment, they said. Mobility and freedom represented the largest public health threats to African-descended people, according to medical students. Fitting with the essentialist logic of polygenesis, that Black people were a different species, students contended that people of African descent would never be prepared for the stress of freedom. Perhaps more important, enslaved people faced serious risks. They fled slavery to the cold climates of the free states. As we all know, a bloody civil war and the triumph of emancipation did not lead to the end of racist medical school curricula. In his 1874 thesis, University of Pennsylvania student and Philadelphia native, Hollingsworth Neal wrote about the anatomical peculiarities of Black people. Supposed, of course. While the nation had abolished slavery, Darwinists mostly had usurped polygenesis in scientific circles, but Neal's thesis closely resembled antebellum theses on racial anatomy. Familiar fashion, he argued that Black people had longer forearms and narrower pelvises. He cited his experiencing dissecting stolen Black people's bodies, or Black people's stolen bodies, and measuring their skulls as a basis for his assertions of white superiority. He explained, quote, the frontal bones of the skull, besides having a smaller cranial capacity in a receding direction have also a larger supraorbital protuberances, very suggestive of the formation in the gorilla, end quote. While historians treat the Civil War as a significant turning point in the history of medicine, and of course, history of slavery and African American history, Neal illustrated that in terms of racial anatomy, little had changed for the better. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., too, continued to lecture about racial difference in craniometry well after the Civil War. For most years, he kept lecture notes. After 1865, he taught that the supposed racial differences of the crania. Differing descriptors were applied, but the broad strokes appeared the same. In 1872, he discussed diversities, national diversities. In 1876 and 77, he orated about crania in different races. In 1880, Holmes taught about orthognathoous and prognathoous skulls, as well as some hints on phrenology. Ensuring that further generations of physicians could learn to measure skulls, when he retired in 1882, Holmes generously donated his craniometer to the Warren Anatomical Museum, where it became object number 7806. Likewise, at the turn of the 20th century, schools of tropical medicine would be founded to train physicians to manage healthcare on tropical corporate plantations. For example, both Tulane and Harvard's schools of tropical health would be heavily funded by the kind of major backers of the United Fruit Company. Clearly, physicians' roles as managers on plantations would not end with slavery. These are just a couple of examples which illustrate how early American medical schools helped enshrine the use of racial categories in medical practice. A focus on institutional racism allows us to unpack how these ideas persisted well after the deaths of their original authors. Ivy League anatomy faculty like Holmes and Leidy taught for more years after the Civil War than before. Moreover, we know that the Darwinian Revolution, which they both subscribed to, did not change the way they described supposed racial anatomical differences. Thus, polygenesis lived on in how physicians were trained to see Black people's bodies as anatomically distinct, even as they believed natural selection, not God, was responsible for these differences. Likewise, in the wake of this new racial medicine, physicians could claim that it was Black people's bodies, not their poor treatment on plantations or poverty in northern cities, that caused them to have lower life expectancies and higher infant mortality rates. Again, issues we're still dealing with today. In short, I argue that institutionalization of racial thought, beginning in early America, has helped justify the persistence of health disparities across profound ideological and political changes in US history. During their earliest attempts at professionalization, medical faculty created and disseminated racial theories that claimed biological, not social determinants were responsible for health disparities. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Professor Willoughby. So if you have a question, you can do so by waving if your camera's on. Otherwise, in the reaction tab, there is a raise hand button that looks like that. And if you have a question, we can call on you, or you could put it in the chat. Well, it was a fantastic presentation, and it's incredibly depressing, I will say, with some having interviewed you before and now hearing the presentation. But I think the thing that jumps out at me the most is how did they square the circle, where you have people, basically doctors using Black bodies, but at the same time looking for differences. Do you know what I mean? So like here we need to have a cadaver to show what the inside of a human looks like, but we only have Black. And you know where I'm going with this?
I know exactly where you're going. It's one of the kind of biggest paradoxes in this history, and I'm proud to say that I found the only piece of evidence where I found someone from that period addressing it. But yeah, it's this paradox of, on the one hand, in places like South Carolina, in many cases in Lexington, Kentucky, at Transylvania University as well, but schools in the South, but also in schools in the Northeast, but particularly the South, almost exclusively enslaved cadavers would have been used to train students in anatomy. Yet they were not trained only in a kind of racialized Black anatomy, but also the idea was you can learn a universal anatomical practice as well as surgical practice on a Black person's body. So the kind of obvious conflict here is, how can it be both universal and different simultaneously? And so here we get to that kind of quote earlier from Leidy about all the different small changes. And so what he argued, and he's the only person I've seen who addressed this head on, was that that these small differences would not affect somebody's ability to operate on someone. Like rather they're, minute in a kind of importance of a naturalist, like a veterinarian could potentially work on different animals. And another thing that's never addressed, but I would say is worth taking into account, this is a period of really disturbing experiments, live experiments on animals that were used to understand physiology or kind of how bodily systems worked on living animals. So they cut open live animals. And so I think we can see an analog there, even though it's not, something we should like, but there's a consistency in using supposedly different species to understand kind of white anatomy, because that was exactly what was happening in physiological research in the period. But in both cases, I would say these are highly, of course, unethical. And in the case of Black anatomy, not verified by science or logical today.
Yeah, and Yvonne has a question in the chat, which says, do we agree that there are some negative leftovers from the period of captivity?
That's a great question. And I would say there are many leftovers, more than we'd like. So one of the studies that I end my book discussing, it's actually kind of the last 2 pages, where I'm a historian, so I stay in the past most of the time. But there was a study done in 2016 of University of Virginia medical students and residents, so kind of interning positions, that showed that a majority still held medical racial stereotypes about Black people's anatomy. So even from like kind of denser bones, thicker skin, insensitivity to pain, that these are lists that come from the 19th and 18th centuries. These are not things that were invented in the 20th century. It's not a product of eugenics. It obviously survived and persisted through. And a second really critical one that I'd point out is this notion of immunity to pain. It has a really deep resonance in history. And there's a really excellent book I'd recommend by a scholar named Sasha Turner called Contested Bodies. I don't remember the subtitle, but it's about maternal and pregnancy practices of enslaved women in Jamaica. And what she found was that, or explains to us, is that in West Africa, in many societies in West Africa, obviously there's a lot of diversity there as well. But Black women culturally tried as hard as possible to show no pain during childbirth, believing it was shameful to display pain. And so her kind of supposition is that possibly physicians were kind of potentially observing this dynamic, but then making the really insane claims that, Black women could birth a child while standing up in the field, experiencing no pain. So that has had really detrimental long-term effects. We have studies that physicians, nurses, and even EMTs are much less likely to give pain medications to Black patients than to white patients. And of course, this still persists despite having had a opioid epidemic, which, especially in the early years of it, was disproportionately affecting white people. So it also really invisibilizes the problems that affect other racial groups as well, these kind of stereotypes. So it's bad for all of us.
Yeah, and one wonders too, like just how much the culture of violence that it was, used to maintain captivity also kind of played into that idea of showing no pain. Because, if you were seen as weak or whatever, you could be punished for that as well. So, it's a possibility, correct?
It's definitely an interesting, definitely a possibility. It's not something that I've ever seen overtly, but it is that, kind of comes up in a weird way in that example of the man with a concussion. And you do wonder, while we know that enslaved people certainly at times would have, like anyone would, claim illness to avoid work in a terrible situation, but this kind of obsessive approach to medical practice also means that many illnesses went untreated, unacknowledged, and were invisibilized by what was really taught in medical schools, not just kind of done by the exigencies of a planter in the South.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Patricia, I know you're always good for something.
So will this be on?
Oh yeah, there'll be a video of this. So there's going to be a video of this, and there's also an interview with Professor Willoughby that I can get on our website. We're also, if you are so inclined, you can enter the summer reading window here, and if you click on the link in the chat, you can enter to win an iPad and all that stuff for attending.
And I'll also note, there's a lot more information in my book. I think this gives a really broad taste and overview of what I cover there. But this is really the tip of the iceberg. It's when I went in and started the research on this project more than 10 years ago, people in archives told me, especially in archives in the Northeast, you're not going to find anything. And what I found was far more than I ever imagined. And enough to where I'm working on a second book just on the skull collection that affected the man Stormon, of telling people's stories whose bodies were collected by Harvard. So it's really the frustrating truth is, I think there's so much more than the medical profession has acknowledged.
And I'll also plug the library and say that we own the book, and it is incredibly readable. So the stories that you tell are well done and really illustrative of the points being made. What can we do about this?
And I suppose it's Griot Yvonne, if I think that's, in my experience at times, I have seen that, especially amongst African-American medical researchers who can be trained in this way of thinking and internalize it. I can't go into depth because it's a private meeting, but I was meeting with the medical researcher who was using what he claimed were African hearts to verify that Black people supposedly responded to cardiac drugs differently. And I asked him, I was like, how did you get African hearts? And he said, well, they're African-American hearts. And, I said, well, how can that be a pure population sample when I'm not a geneticist, but we know the history of rape on plantations through, also intermixture at the working class levels, more often on a voluntary level, that many African-Americans have more diverse backgrounds, just as many European or white Americans do as well. So how can you use those as essential kind of racial stand-ins? So I think that's a really astute point, like that this has, captured the imagination of many people in such a convincing way that what should be really common sense, you can find medical researchers who I'm sure have experienced racism, believing these same ideas.
Yeah, and then do you have any comments on what can be done to kind of address this in the medical profession? It's kind of out of your purview as far as a historian, but.
No, it's actually a colleague and I are working on, who's a medical professor, or two medical professors working on an article that we're hoping to get published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that we would like to see a standard of when race is discussed in medical education, that it's clearly identified as a social determinant of health, not a biological one. I would also like to see, I think it's a harder lift because that's just correcting inaccurate information, but more historical literacy amongst medical students so they can see the deep resonances of this, because how often race is discussed is in bioethics, which is good. We need to discuss in bioethics, but you could get the impression that, once again, this is a relatively new phenomena that has a short lifespan, whereas, the earliest kind of racial utterances around health go back to the 17th century, like Jamestown, So while it becomes very formal in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is a very long history, and extricating it, and I think somebody mentioned Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, but extricating it from medicine requires grappling with that. But I think first and foremost, making sure that medical faculty are trained to understand that these are social determinants, and actually putting regulations that require physicians, when they discuss race, to discuss what it means, how they're using it, and that it's really social factors that are causing disparities, not essential biological features, which there's really no evidence for, and causes ill health. I mean, if I have a minute, I can go into one more really disgusting, frustrating example. But I was giving a talk earlier or late last year with a medical student, an advanced African-American medical student at Yale's medical school. We were on a panel together, and she's written about this. I need to memorize her name. I haven't seen her in several months, but she had a guest lecture she had two different things, but I'll stick with this one. She was doing the rounds with in a maternity ward with a physician who told them that Black women and Asian American women needed their epidurals set more deeply in their spine because it otherwise wouldn't affect them. What's frustrating is a couple months later, there was a piece in the New York Times about, and I believe this was in a hospital in an area that was disproportionately African-American. Many 9 or 10 women had been killed by physicians at this hospital for having their epidural placed too deeply. Placing an epidural too deeply can be fatal. So these effects have real life problems. Of course, maternal mortality is much worse for African-American women. Infant mortality is higher, and just general life expectancy. And this also, as much as I think we need to acknowledge class and poverty as well, these also cut along class lines. So wealthier African-American women will experience higher rates of maternal mortality as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I believe that Yale panel is where I first heard you speak, which then led me to contact you. So that's a happy coincidence.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way, but I can find that article and send it to you, because it's very eye-opening about what's happening in our absolutely most elite medical schools today. Still, and despite having real attempts to extricate it.
That's correct. And I would like to just plug next month, we're having similar discussion on how the yellow fever in New Orleans during this antebellum period to just beyond affected the African-American community, both free and slave, in the city and in the state. So that will be the last Thursday or second to last Thursday of next month. And then the following month will be eugenics, as Christopher reminded me. So hopefully everyone will tune in, enter to win an iPad, and hopefully have a good night. Thank you again for presenting tonight. It's a fantastic presentation you have, and it's such a great wealth of knowledge you present. So thank you for that.
Thank you sincerely for having me and for people coming out to listen. I know it's not a fun topic, but it's important.
Very important.